are very welcome to today's CBI webinar. My name's Kerry Thomas. I'm an editor at a new startup called Tortoise. Great pleasure as ever to be doing these webinars with CBI. And actually, I should thank the CBI because it's they who decide the topics, they who get us the great guests and the great panel. So thank you to them for making these things so interesting every Monday and Wednesday. I guess throughout this pandemic, the CBI has been saying a couple of things consistently about business rates. First, I suppose they've been saying thank you to the Treasury for the relief that it gave early in the pandemic. But by the way, they've also been saying, doesn't the fact that that was one of the first things that you did show what a drain on businesses business rates can be? And secondly, the CBI has been saying the pandemic has fast forwarded the need for reform of a system that a lot of people think is unfair and broken. and the CBI's latest ideas for reform, which they've drawn up in 2 reports with the help of the commercial real estate firm Avison Young, are what's on our agenda today. I mean, it's an interesting time to talk about taxes on businesses. As you know, the Chancellor's 1-year spending review is happening later today, but it's not an easy time to talk about cutting taxes because Rishi Sunak has already indicated that they're going to have to start going up again soon, potentially in his budget next year. So we've got a great panel to help us get our heads around all these things. We have David Jones, Managing Director of Avison Young, the commercial real estate company, who's been working with the CBI, as I say, on these 2 big reports. We've got Faisal Shafiq, who's Head of Direct Taxes at Marks and Spencer. And we've got Annie Gascoigne, who's Director of Economic Policy at the CBI. Lovely to have you all with us. As ever, though, people who are regulars on these calls will know that what we want most of all is questions from you. So you will see on your screen there somewhere a button that says question. Do press it, do fire in questions, comments, thoughts on anything that we're talking about. It'll help in a couple of ways. It'll help steer this discussion, but it would also help the CBI to understand what the mood is, what the concerns are out there, and that stuff can find its way through to government in the longer term. So do, and if you want to submit things anonymously, then just write anon in the subject line, and we will treat that in confidence, of course. But let me start with Annie Gascoigne from the CBI. Morning, Annie.
Morning.
Let's do what we always do and just run around some of the big developments this week. We'll come to the Chancellor's statement in a second, but what's been happening in more general terms?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's been a big week on COVID. We've obviously seen the latest couple of announcements from the Prime Minister about what will happen after we exit the current England-wide restrictions. And he's obviously confirmed that they will, in fact, end on the 2nd of December as planned. And people will now be able to go outdoor, meet in public spaces, subject to the rule of 6 again, and shops and gyms and leisure facilities can stay open. And we've also had confirmation this week, which is positive, that we've had this notice period, I think, particularly for businesses who are gearing up for the 2nd of December, is that we will kind of re-enter the tiering system from that point. And what we're expecting tomorrow, in fact, is details of which regions are going to enter which tiers. But the thing to note about the tiering system that we'll be re-entering is it is different from the system that we had pre the current restrictions over November. So tier 1, people will continue to be encouraged to work from home where possible. Tier 2, pubs and bars must close unless serving substantial meals along with drinks. And in tier 3, more restrictions around kind of hospitality closing, except for deliveries and takeaways alongside accommodation services and indoor entertainment. We also know that the curfew has been modified, so people can get last orders in at 10, but venues actually closing at 11 to try and manage the flow of people as they leave venues. And we're also we've also heard about the kind of the easement of restrictions across the UK for Christmas, and in particular that period over Christmas, people being able to meet indoors in three family bubbles. And yeah, as I say, I think all eyes now on Thursday to see what it means for each local area. In terms of what the CBI is doing, we're continuing to work with the government, with the Department for Health, and with the Treasury on kind of the implications of this for business, and thinking about both the guidance and the sort of financial support available for firms. So it's a big week in the world of COVID.
Yeah, and so then let's come to the Chancellor spending review this afternoon. So not a budget, just a spending review. Actually, for him, this is the easy bit, isn't it? He's spending money. He's not particularly trying to raise it this afternoon. Can you give us a sort of stock take of where you think we are economically as we go into this spending review?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I think everybody knows by now the sort of story about the lopsided V. We saw a record fall in GDP in the second quarter, rebounding quite significantly in the third quarter. And actually, so far we're on the largest single year fall in GDP that the UK has ever experienced. And so where we are now is that the UK is around 9.7% smaller as a whole than it was at the end of 2019. That is a massive decline. What is concerning, of course, is that as we entered October and further restrictions were introduced in November, we saw the easing of that recovery. And we've also seen that in our kind of high frequency indicators, suggesting that momentum in the UK and many other major economies continue to slow in October. And in terms of where November leaves us, I mean, it's too early to see the GDP data from the ONS, but estimates say that the hit to UK GDP could be in the range of 5 to 10%. So we're expecting to see another dip from this period of restrictions, particularly in England. But I think what's notable is that it isn't exactly like the first sort of national lockdown that we went into. Firstly, fewer sectors are affected by restrictions. In particular, schools are still open, although of course we heard yesterday about the level of absences in schools, and that is something concerning, not only for the short term and the challenges that creates in terms of childcare and people being able to work, but also in terms of the long-term prospects for the skills and education of our young people. But in general, schools being reopened has been a really positive thing. And also, generally speaking, businesses that are open and have remained open through these restrictions are much better prepared to operate under COVID secure guidelines. You've got to remember that when we went into the first restrictions, a lot of manufacturing firms had to temporarily close because they didn't have the guidance, they didn't have the measures in place to ensure those workplaces were COVID secure. And that hasn't happened this time. So we have been able to continue on in many sectors in the way that we had been doing, although clearly the subdued demand and wider economic conditions are still a constraint on a number of sectors. And I think thirdly, we have seen the extension of the job retention scheme until the end of March, and that has really helped protect those firms that are most, those firms and those jobs that are most impacted by these restrictions, clearly in hospitality, non-essential retail and leisure. The Bank of England suggests that estimates put around kind of 5.5 million employees on furlough in November. Estimates from other sources vary, some saying 3 million. It'll take a while before we see the kind of firm HMRC data come through, but I think somewhere in that region it is a reasonable estimate at this point. And I think the other thing we're also seeing is we're continuing to see that change in consumer spending behaviour away from consumption, social consumption, towards more retail and goods consumption, just driven by access to those. So I think that's the kind of backdrop through which the Chancellor is kind of viewing the spending review.
Yeah, I guess the other big factor in that backdrop is the good news on the vaccine, which we've had this week, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So the prospect of really wide-scale, big-scale vaccination programs beginning before Christmas. So taking all that together, Annie, what are you hoping to hear from the Chancellor this afternoon?
Yes, so I mean, absolutely, the vaccine is a really interesting one because it will take some time to figure out how that will play out in terms of the economic picture. And I think that's why when we think about the spending review that we're expecting this afternoon, it's not going to necessarily be about the kind of immediate COVID response, because we still need to see how some of this plays out. But what we are hoping for, and I think what has already been trailed somewhat in the media, is some progress on some really critical issues that have been kind of long delayed for all manner of reasons. First of all, Brexit, and now COVID, and we're clearly in a 1-year spending review, which is less desirable than I think where we would have wanted to be, given that this is the second of its type this Parliament. That said, I think what is positive is that we've seen quite a lot of movement on the green agenda, on net zero, and the Prime Minister's kind of 10-point plan in that area. A lot of good stuff around commitments to infrastructure investment in the energy sector. More broadly on infrastructure, we're expecting and hoping to see the National Infrastructure Strategy finally published, which will give lots of firms the kind of certainty and clarity they need to be able to start, putting their ducks in a row to deliver against some of that government and private sector procurement. And alongside that, we're also going to see some policies announced in response to the fact that the UK is shortly going to be leaving the European Union. So a national investment bank to replace European investment bank funding for infrastructure, and also the UK shared prosperity fund, which replaces the EU structural funds. So clearly the Chancellor using this to sort of set out some of the policies that are going to be needed in a post-Brexit world. We're also seeing, some action on the kind of the levelling up agenda. It's a bit nerdy, but the Green Book and how government actually makes decisions about where to spend money geographically is going to change to address the challenges with balancing investment in less populated regions with investment in more sort of densely populated regions, which is obviously a challenge if you're looking at just aggregate figures. And I think, it'll be interesting to see whether he makes any indications about what might happen next year, sort of heading towards the budget. He's already started to make signals about needing to rebalance the public finances in the long term. But I think we're not going to see that as part of the spending review. But clearly he's as he has done throughout the crisis, laying down the appropriate markers to set expectations in that area.
Okay, Annie, thanks for that. Incredibly useful just to have that overview. But let's now turn to the subject at hand, the question of business rates. So I'm going to bring David Jones in from Everson Young, because David, I know you've been working with the CBI on these two major reports that you've put together with each other. Can you just give us a sort of a beginner's guide to the setup that you were looking at as you began work on these two reports?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, we've found it really sort of an interesting project. We've really enjoyed working with the CBI and sort of combining our skill sets. It's I think the important thing, probably, I'll just give everybody a very quick overview of business rates, because there might be some people on the call who don't really understand, what it's about. But I won't go into too much detail because it's a fairly complicated tax. But basically, it's really unlike any other tax that the government collects. I think it's really important for people to understand that it's guaranteed income by government. It goes up by inflation every year. And even though there were revaluations, which should be 5 years, we've had 7 years, and now we're going to have 6 years. Basically, it goes up by inflation. It's guaranteed for government. It's very, very unusual. So in that respect, it's made up really of two main elements. You've got the rateable value, which is effectively the rent, and then you've got the uniform business rate or multiplier that's applied to that rent to calculate the liability. Now, the people who set that are the Valuation Office Agency, who are part of HM Revenue and Customs, and they're basically there to determine what that rent is at a certain point in time. So, and then we have revaluations, I've said, to try and redistribute the tax base, because obviously some sectors have done better than others, some geographies and areas have performed better than others. And the issue that's at stake here is really about, I suppose in many ways, this sort of uniform business rate, which has been under close scrutiny through this reform period. And what revaluations do really is they do effectively divide the total rateable value into that total, into the gross receipts, and that gives us a uniform business rate. So if the RV pool increases, the uniform business rate goes down, and if the RV pool decreases, the uniform business rate goes up. So in principle, it all sounds very, very workable, and it all goes very, it should go swimmingly. And government really likes it as a revenue, and it has this sort of association with local government funding. The problem is, I think, that it's in essence, it's failing. And I think the reason why it's failing is really the number one issue for business. And this is what we covered in tranche 1, was the issue around the cost of it. And the fact that there's been an inexorable increase in business rates over many years, which is way out of kilter with rents. So in essence, if we look at when the uniform business rate first came in 1990, and we look at it now, it's outpaced rental growth by about 40%. So the government's had this guarantee based around inflation. It's meant that it's continued to grow, where rents have actually not kept pace, which is why we've seen this big explosion in the uniform business rate. The problem also is the government got greedy with it because they guaranteed revenue. When we went through the financial crisis, they actually saw business rates as sort of an easy hit. So rather than actually shift it from what would be the lower CPI inflation measure, they kept it on the RPI inflation measure. And as a result, which is basically the way they pay out benefits, they do it on the CPI, not the RPI measure. And the result of that cost business over a 7-year period until they shifted it about 13 billion, and it increased the uniform business rate to this 50p, which is the highest base rate of tax that we actually have in the UK. I personally think it's damaged business activity, and I think it's particularly damaged business activity around the sort of struggling bricks and mortar traditional retail sector. So what we effectively asked for was that basically total gross receipts guaranteed by government should fall by about £5 to £6 billion a year. So we actually saw the reversal, almost going back to the position that existed before, in relation to the RPI CPI position. And to do that, they have to lower the uniform business rate and to remove that guaranteed inflation element, and that all future growth would be purely linked to rental performance. And then also we need more regular evaluations. At the moment, we've had this really odd situation where they were originally 5 years, then the government, due to problems and the election in 2013, shifted it to 7 years. We've just had the postponement announcement, so in the 2021 revaluation, for the right reasons, because of COVID-19, the difficulties for business, has shifted it to 2023. But unfortunately, that's now 6 years. So the relevance all the time of business rates to what's actually happening to the economy, and particularly sectors like retail, is just becoming further and further apart. So what we want to see is the comfort blanket of business rates for government. We want to see it removed. And I think in our first submission, Overrated, we achieved the right balance between sort of understanding the stresses on the public purse, and don't get me wrong, they are significant, and as we all know, but the need to reduce the overall burden for businesses by quite a significant amount to address the fact that business rates is getting out of kilter.
Okay, so we've talked about these 2 reports that you did. The first, I think, really dealt with sort of fundamental reforms to the system, and the second, which we can come to, looked at how you tie incentives within the system to a green agenda. Can you take us through what, in your first report, you recommended as changes to the system?
Yeah, I mean, the first piece was centered around understanding really where we are now, and then drawing conclusions as to what could be sensibly achieved. I mean, I think ultimately we want total business rates collected to be lower because we think it's hitting certain sectors more than disproportionately, and it needs to be more relevant to the economy because we need revaluations which are effectively much shorter, and dates of valuation to be much closer to those revaluation periods. And what we first did to help sort of frame that advice, we first could rely on Avison Young's 2019 research piece, which was Win, Lose or Draws, and this basically highlighted that the decision by government to delay the revaluation from 2021 to 2023 and looking purely at retail has actually cost retail 1.3 billion because the market has fallen and they're not getting addressed for another 2 years. So we initially asked government, we want that 1.3 billion given back to retail over the next 2 years. Then we asked ourselves, if COVID-19 was no longer a material factor when we come to value for 2023, what would the uniform business rate be if there was no government intervention, no reform going on? And basically, we would see the uniform business rate just continue to escalate. So if you think by 2023, the government would be collecting about £35 billion in business rates, and we estimate that would give us a uniform business rate of somewhere in the region of 52p. And it means that by the end of the 3-year revaluation period, The uniform business rate would then, when you add in supplements and other things, we were looking at 55 to nearly 60p in the pound. Now, that is an extraordinary amount of business rates. So it's significantly higher than it's ever been. So we know the business rates, the uniform business rate is only going one way, which is up, if we carry on with the current system. So in addition to the 1.3 billion help we asked for retail, we also asked for additional measures, which is a lot of money. There are issues about how the government is going to fund this. We wanted the uniform business rate to be frozen for a further 2 years. And we estimated that would cost the Exchequer about 0.8 of a billion. We then asked government from 2023 to reduce the gross receipts collected from business rates from the 35 billion to around 30 billion. And we calculate this would drop the uniform business rate from 52p to about 44p. And then we advocated that that 44p would remain fixed thereafter, and that at any subsequent revaluation, rental growth would determine the growth the government received from business rates. And what we then, it's interesting, we come back to the issues around the retail sector, but actually it's quite interesting to see how that would play out for the retail sector based on the research that we undertook. So basically, you can understand why the retail sector is a great advocate, and Faisal will come on to explain that in significantly more detail than I can. But basically, at the moment, they pay about 30% of all business rates, and it's twice the percentage of fixed cost than any other sector. It's going through massive structural change at the moment with the issues around e-commerce. We estimate that if we had a 2023 revaluation, we'd see nearly a 25% fall in rents, in retail rents. And when you apply a lower uniform business rate of around about 44p, you'd be looking for savings to retail of about 3.65 billion. And in year one, and that would go on in subsequent years as well. So rather than pay 30% of 35 billion, we think the retail sector would see a massive readjustment. I mean, every sector would benefit from a lower uniform business rate, but retail would see itself reposition from the exposure of 24% to 30 billion. It's that sort of dramatic for the retail sector. But to implement that, and this is the last piece on this, to implement that, the government has got to do away with downwards transition. This is this very odd system that phases in small reductions in liability as a result of a revaluation. It's the most inequitable system. Basically, it's there to fund people facing big increases. We want to see them to do away with it. It's completely inequitable, and that basically business receives the benefit from a revaluation based on RV times UBR from day one, and how the government then intends to sort of fund those facing significant increases is really their own problem, and they need to look at other forms of revenue.
Okay, David,
so that's really it.
That's great. I tell you what, we'll come to your second report a little later, because I do want to come to Faisal, because I think it's very important to hear sort of the front line of this. Faisal, you're from Marks and Spencer. Looking at this business rate system, are the problems with it only to do with the fact that it just costs you too much, or do you see, regardless of cost, improvements that could be made to the system anyway?
Morning, everyone, and thanks, Kerry. There's two things. First of all, the cost element is huge for us, and it's particularly because as a bricks and mortar high street business, we bear the tax bill on rates, which, as David just mentioned, is not linked to the performance of a certain property. It's a fixed system. So a store could be making a loss, for example, or less footfall, and you still have this cost. So, and that adds to the challenge, which I think we can all agree the retail sector has been going through anyway, even before the pandemic hit. We've had lots of cases of businesses closing and shutting down, and deserted high streets, and the associated impact that has on local economy and indeed local community. So it's a huge cost. And I would echo a lot of what David has said in terms of what needs to be done to redress some of the balance. I think we are very happy to acknowledge that there is a place for business rates within the system, because realistically speaking, it's a huge tax take for the Treasury. So it would be unrealistic to say, well, can we do away with it? I think, and given this particular time, it's worth realizing there's no appetite in terms of reducing the overall tax take for the Treasury. In fact, it probably might go the other way, depending on, considering the support and the COVID pandemic situation. So what our ask would be is to sort of is some sort of a redressing of the system and redressing the way taxes are spread out between the different taxes, such that certain sectors are not disproportionately worse hit than others.
And if there's a great focus on the high streets, as you say, there's a great focus in government now on towns and how to revive our town centres as opposed to just the cities. Can you do that, do you think, without reform of the business rate system?
It will certainly be quite difficult, as I said, because of the huge cost and because of the shift, or almost a permanent shift, to online as well. So the business rate system has not really kept up with the times, if you like, in terms of where money is being created and where money is being taxed. To give you an example, if you look back 30-year data, for example, on some of the stores, the footfall as a natural progression from business moving from stores to online has almost halved in that period of time in certain states. If you look at the business rates bill in that same period of time, it's almost doubled. And that, I think, is not really sustainable, and therefore something has to be done to reduce that burden if we are to revive the town centres, and which ultimately actually helps the broader and overall economy as well, because deserted town centres and closing stores does not really help the overall tax take. So retail sector, for example, it employs is the largest private employer within the economy. So there is a sort of consequential effect in terms of how much employers' taxes retailers pay along with business rates. So it's not just business rates. And if a store closes down, there's a huge impact on the local economy and community in terms of job losses, etc. There's also the impact that there's not going to be any business rates being generated from that property. But then you also have the loss of the other taxes, the employer taxes as well, which are not going to be collected. So therefore, I think it needs to be looked at in an overall and broader context of the entire tax system. So, if we want to keep those revenue receipts going forward at the same level, what that probably means is reducing the business rates, providing relief to the business, particularly high street retailers, such that it helps keeping the stores running and also helps with the investment as well, because currently it's just a very big burden.
Yeah, okay. Annie, I think we're getting really into the interesting questions now, because we had a question in from Andrew Heatherton, who's on the webinar, to say that the approach to take out £6 billion, which is the figure that David suggested, which supports local government. What are you going to do to offset that? Are you in favour of a sales tax, increased corporation tax, tourist tax, a landlord-based tax? That's a huge sum to local government, which is already under enormous pressure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of our kind of guiding principles is that local authorities should not be kind of losing out on business rates reform. And I think this is where you have a challenge actually with increasing kind of devolution of business rates. It's all very well and good in principle, but devolving something that's fundamentally broken just leaves local authorities with a headache, rather than actually giving them any real power and authority and control over it, because you're just devolving the problem. So I think you need to fix the system at the core, and then you can look at kind of devolving so that local authorities have a sustainable tax base. So taking that to one side and assuming that that needs to be done, I think there is then a question about where do you fill the gap? Exactly as Faisal said, it's not realistic to get rid of the tax entirely. As we've said, Rishi's probably going to talk today a little bit about where we'll need to raise taxes in the future. But you've got to bear in mind that I think First of all, it's from a business tax perspective, it's a fixed cost, and it's not something that is associated with profitability of a firm. And that is a real challenge. But also from an international perspective, the UK is out of kilter on business rates. We get significantly more revenue from business rates and property taxes on business in the UK than other G7 countries. And that has implications for inward investment in property. And if you look at business investment data, where the UK is underperforming compared to our G7 peers, we're bottom of the league table. Actually, a lot of that is driven by poor levels of investment in buildings and structures. So in tax, there's always a payback. If you reduce taxes, it can incentivize business spending, investment in other ways. And exactly as Faisal has just said, that has the multiplier effect of you're creating opportunity. Maybe there's knock-on impact for corporation tax, employment taxes, etc. So there is payback if you calibrate it in the right way. And that's not to duck away from the fact that probably overall it will cost government money, but you know, the government will need to look broader than trying to stay revenue neutral in business rates reform. I don't think that is a sustainable position at this point, at this juncture. We'll need to look at other taxes.
And Faisal, presumably from a Marks and Spencer perspective, profitability within the company is one thing, but are you really more interested in profitability within an individual store on a particular site? Is that a best measure of where the tax should fall?
I think so. If we work on the basis that, you know, some of the parts makes the whole, and you know, within each store it has to be profitable to make up the whole part. And I think commercially, if you have sites which are periodically loss-making, and the costs are such that we can't break even, that's when sort of you have to start thinking about sort of, is that site worth operating? So I think each individual store has to run a profitable basis. I think there are certain sites where, for example, due to the sort of high fixed cost of which business rates is part of that equation, if we were to close that site, I don't think there's another retailer on that site ready to rent that space out. And that will be an empty boxed building, if you like, for the next X amount of time, with the loss of revenue, but also all the associated with the losses as well. So I think it has to work overall within the total retail estate, particularly for retailers who have a bricks and mortar asset base.
David, let me come back to you and ask you to square this circle a bit. So I'm going to be the chancellor for a moment here. It won't last, don't worry. But if I do that for a moment, so I'm saying I'm actually, as Annie said, I'm in the business now of raising taxes. I can't afford to have a substantial source of revenue like this cut. I take Annie's point. In the long run, I want reform, but I can't lose money in the here and now. So tell me what reforms you think you would implement now, before we get to the business of actually reducing the take from business rates.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a way that probably feeds more onto the problem is, in reality, the reforms that we're talking about are really more around the technical aspects of business rates. I mean, the other element we talked about feeds more into that second tranche paper. We talked about the concept of investment, which feeds onto the point that Annie made. I have real concerns about whether business rates, if it isn't reformed, is going to be a sort of have an impact on investment going forward. So when we actually did our second tranche paper, we really talked around the need for, you know, the problems that the country's got around issues around hitting zero carbon emissions. The fact we've got issues again around Brexit and all the other things. And really what we want business rates to become is really a lever to help accelerate the process and to try and improve the ability to invest in your building. It's a really odd tax business rate. You improve your building, you put in new plant machinery, you put solar voltaic cells on you have to pay more in business rates. That's a real downer for business. You know, and we've got a number of clients, and I was talking to anyone the other day, they have decided not to invest in the UK and to move their operation to Europe. And one of the major issues around that was business rates. And I think that can't be underplayed. And that it often is just on the edge of making that decision making, particularly people who've got, again, businesses that are very focused on property. and the need to make lots of investment. So, you know, we want business to make the right decision, and we want to work in sustainable and energy efficient buildings, and we don't want to see their rate liabilities increase the consequence of that. We want sort of you know, business rates. We think business rates is bad for the economy as well in many ways, and we think it's also bad for the environment. So we want to encourage good behaviour, want to help drive levels of investment. So what we're proposing is that all improvements, so if anybody ever improves their building and it would result in an increase in rateable value, we think they should get a 12 months exemption from an increase to try and encourage people to invest, to help with the capex. We then have these things called energy performance certificates, EPCs, which aren't working particularly well, and there's a 2020 action plan by government. We really want them to instigate that. But again, if you were to undertake improvements which resulted in your building improving from an energy performance certificate point of view, and it would upgrade the rating, we would want anywhere between 6 months to additional 2 years of not having to pay the increase in tax, again to try and encourage people to spend the capex. And then we want things like solar voltaic cells and other forms of heating and other things that principally ensure that you can that's wholly or mainly used for the premises to improve the premises, not that's going to be stuck onto the grid and you can create a profit from, but those will become exempt from rating. So we're looking to try and encourage, because it's an odd tax, it encourages bad behaviour, not good behaviour. And we need it to encourage good behaviour, and the government needs to look at it in that context.
Okay, that's fascinating. Let me just turn to a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. Andy, let me put this one to you. So we had a question from Sina Azeri, obviously interested in reform in the long run, but I think like a lot of businesses, very much focused on the here and now. And is wondering whether you see any prospect of a continuation of business rate relief beyond the current endpoint.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question, because absolutely right. As well as this kind of fundamental reform project that was kind of put in train before the COVID crisis, we've had a huge relief, temporary relief introduced for retail, hospitality and leisure that comes to an end next year. Incidentally, also the end of that relief also coincides with the end of other business support, like at the moment the planned end of the job retention scheme, loan schemes, tax deferrals and grant schemes all coming to an end. So working back from March, you have a crunch point for a Chancellor decision in January around what he wants to do in terms of further business support. And I think it's clear that we can't have just a cliff edge. David's already talked about the massive kind of rates that we see on business rates, you know, the uniform business rate. And we can't see a kind of cliff edge of going from having paid no tax to suddenly having to pay it all next year after a really tough year for a lot of retailers, hospitality and leisure businesses. But I think, and I noticed there was somebody else in the chat, I think one of the things to really consider is there are a huge number of sectors that haven't had any relief thus far this year, and they are sectors, whether they're in the supply chains of retail, hospitality and leisure, or indeed have had dramatic impact on their revenue. We saw only this week that there has been finally some movement on relief for airports, which is something that's long been called for, and the CBI also believes that's a sector that's in need. So I think there's an opportunity in January for the Chancellor to look sort of realistically at which sectors are continuing to struggle with the cost of property and associated costs, and say where do we need to kind of continue this, and actually I think at that point there will need to be a kind of, alongside the fundamental reform where we want to see it lowered for everyone, where are the sectors that continue to need short-term support. So absolutely, I think that's part of probably, well, definitely part of the CBI's work at the moment and the very start of 2021.
Yeah, no, you're right. The question that you spotted was from Mark North, who works for the Mineral Products Association. And what he was pointing out was that industry that sector has had no business rate relief at all. He's looking across at supermarkets, which have traded throughout this, and some of which have done very well. You can tell me if Marks and Spencer is part of that or not, but and there isn't a logic, is there, to how the business rates relief has been applied?
No, I mean, other than it being very broadly hospitality, retail and leisure. And I think, I mean, in the conversations we've had with the Treasury, I think the thing to note is that the relief was introduced very quickly, and it was introduced in a way that it could be delivered promptly, because you've got to remember that it's been delivered through local authorities who were no doubt completely overwhelmed at the start of this crisis with everything else they had to do. So simplicity in everything that the Treasury did at the start of this crisis in terms of business support was absolutely central to all the policy they introduced. Simplicity and having it easily accessible with not too much hoops to jump through. There are also conversations we've had with the Treasury about the boundary issues and the relationship with state aid. And this is a real challenge in terms of thinking about where next on the short-term business rates relief, because state aid did prevent relief from being extended to certain sectors, according to the conversations we've had. But that has really been a challenge, because exactly as Mark said, there are lots of sectors that haven't had the relief when actually it really would have helped and would continue to help going forward.
Yeah. Faisal, can I come back to you just to pick up on some of the points David was making in his last contribution? So this idea that there is a positive disincentive to invest in the quality of your buildings, in the energy efficiency of your buildings, because you'll get penalised for that through business rates in the longer run. Is that your experience at Marks & Spencer?
Before I answer that question, just one point I think it's also worth making around the business rates relief that we've had is, it's right that it's been uniformly applied, and it may be that because of the simplicity of it, some businesses that might have done quite well out of the pandemic or haven't been affected the same way have had relief, while some other businesses have not had the relief. For us, it's been a lifesaver in the way that our footfall on some of the stores was down by 80%, and it's not back to normal yet, and we're not expecting it to go back to normal anytime soon again. So we would really welcome an extension of the relief, perhaps in a slightly more targeted way, where it's targeted to properties that actually need more relief rather than a uniform relief. But coming back to your question, it definitely does impact decisions around sort of investment to a certain extent, based on what David was saying, because of the incentives and but that may or may not stop us from investing. So you have to have your stores and property in a certain state, so you still invest. The broader impact of it in terms of investment is around the sort of overall feasibility of running the stores or opening new stores, for example, or indeed it comes into the decision when you're looking at sort of closing a certain store or assessing the viability of a certain site. So it's very broad, and it certainly does impact all those investment decisions and cash outflow, etc.
Okay, look, we are.
There was an issue I wanted to raise, Kerry, actually. So before we just go on, although there is the issue of relief, but there's also the issue of challenging the value. And I think that the rateable value, hundreds of thousands of challenges have been put in, and we're in the process at the moment of trying to get those resolved. They will offer actually those sectors, in effect, the allowances they need through reducing the rateable value. And by doing that, it's something that that can be controlled by government. It needs to be evidenced. So in some ways, I absolutely agree, by the way, that the continuation of retail, some form of retail and hospitality relief going forward. But I think for the other sectors, though, that can be achieved, that adjustment, through reductions in the rateable value. And that process is going on at the moment. So it's not just a question of relief, it's a question of reducing the values, I think, as well. The government needs to commit to making that done quickly and put pressure on the valuation office agency to get on with it.
That is a big and important note on which to end. So thank you for that, David. We're categorically out of time. So let me thank Faisal, let me thank David, let me thank Annie for helping us navigate this quite technical and complicated area so succinctly and brilliantly. We will be back next Monday with the next webinar, but thank you very much for joining us today.